Imagine like trying to start a brand new religion, right? And it's built entirely on a lie. Your goal is to convince people that your recently executed leader has, well, miraculously returned from the dead.
Right, yeah.
But here's the catch. You decide to launch this massive scam in the exact same city, right under the noses of the exact same hostile authorities who just crucified him like a few weeks ago.
Which is just, historically speaking, a terrible strategy for a hoax.
Oh, absolutely terrible.
I mean, it is essentially asking to be shut down before you even get started.
Yeah.
If you are fabricating a story of that magnitude, you take it to the provinces.
Right, you go away.
Yeah, you go somewhere hundreds of miles away from the physical evidence and, well, the people who actually witnessed the execution.
Exactly. And welcome to the deep dive. So our mission today is to unpack a very specific historical and religious argument found in a source text.
Right, an article.
Yeah, an article titled, "Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead?" by a channel called Sincere Catholic. We are, stepping into the mechanics of first century history here.
We really are, and it's fascinating.
It is. But before we get into it, I want to make our goal here absolutely clear to you listening. We are not here to take a religious stance, or endorse a theology, or even try to definitively prove a divine miracle.
No, not at all.
Right. We are impartially examining how this specific apologetic argument is constructed. We are looking at how it uses historical data points to actively push back against skeptics who claim the resurrection is just, a legend.
Yeah, it is really an exercise in analyzing a structured counter-argument. The source text builds its case on 4 foundational historical data points.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, that Jesus truly died. Second, that the tomb was found empty. Third, that early followers claimed to actually encounter the risen Christ. And fourth, that Christianity explosively launched from Jerusalem itself.
In that same city.
Exactly. The author argues that when you layer these historical realities together, the legend theory just it collapses.
So to dismantle the idea that this is just a legend, we first have to understand how legends actually form in human history, right? It is not like that simple game of telephone we played as kids. It is much more like a massive software update rollout across the ancient world.
That is a good way to put it.
It takes decades, sometimes centuries, for a new version of a story to take hold. The one where the hero gets braver or the miracles are added. It takes time for that to slowly replace the old operating system across countless isolated villages.
Yeah, that slow burn is the traditional model for myth-making. You start with a charismatic teacher, and slowly, over generations, zealous followers add these supernatural layers.
Because the original people are dead.
Right. The skeptical argument naturally relies on this long, vague timeline. But the Catholic apologetic approach counters this by pointing to a highly specific text.
Which text?
It is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. I mean, why does a single passage in a letter to the Corinthians blow up the traditional legend timeline?
Because, well, scholars do not treat this specific passage as a regular paragraph that the Apostle Paul just wrote off the cuff. They actually identify it as an early Christian creed.
Oh, okay.
And when historians analyze the linguistics of this passage, they date its origins to within just a few years of the crucifixion. In some historical models, it's actually dated to within months.
Wait, really? How do they actually know that? I mean, if Paul wrote the letter to Corinth a couple of decades later, how can historians confidently say the poem inside it is older than the letter itself?
It mostly comes down to linguistic structure and cultural transmission.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So, in the original Greek, this passage has a highly stylized rhythmic cadence. It reads like an early hymn or a mnemonic device.
Like a memory trick.
Exactly. In oral cultures of the first century, before things were widely written down and distributed, people used strict rhythmic structures to perfectly memorize and transmit important information.
Oh, that makes sense. It is similar to how you can remember the lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 10 years, even if you can't remember what you had for breakfast yesterday.
That is a perfect comparison. The rhythm preserves the data. And Paul even prefaces it by saying, "For I delivered to you what I also received."
So he is explicitly quoting a pre-existing, formalized tradition. He is essentially pasting a link to an earlier document.
That is a great way to think about it. And the content of that early creed is highly specific.
What does it actually say?
It states that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he rose again on the third day, and that he was seen by Cephas, and after that by the 12.
Just a quick note for you listening. When the text says Cephas, that is the Aramaic name for Peter. So the creed is explicitly naming the top leader of the movement.
Right.
And notice there is no vague spiritualizing there. It doesn't say, like, his spirit lives on in the trees. It is a rapid-fire list of physical events. He died, he was buried, he rose, he was seen.
Yeah, and that timeline compression is the first major hurdle for the legend theory. A legend needs breathing room to grow.
Right. It needs the original eyewitnesses to pass away so nobody is around to fact-check the supernatural exaggeration.
Exactly. The source argues that an established creed circulating within a few years of the event is simply too early for a myth to have crystallized.
But, early words do not mean much without an empty grave to back them up.
Sure.
If I'm a skeptic living in first century Jerusalem, my very first step is taking a short walk down the street to check the tomb. The narrative really has to move from the written claims to the physical location.
It does.
So how does the text handle the physical reality of the grave?
Well, this shifts the focus to the gospel accounts of the tomb itself. And the Sincere Catholic article highlights a deeply counterintuitive detail here.
Okay, what is it?
It is not merely the claim that the tomb was empty. It is who is reported to have found it empty first. All the gospel accounts point to women being the initial discoverers.
Okay, let's view that through the lens of first century Jewish culture. Because if I am trying to manufacture a bulletproof lie for a highly skeptical audience, I am going to use witnesses that the audience implicitly respects and trusts.
Oh, definitely.
I would claim the high priest found the tomb empty, or a Roman centurion, or at the absolute least, I would write that Peter and the male disciples found it first.
Right, because in that specific cultural and legal context, women's testimony carried very little legal weight.
Really?
Yeah, historical sources like Josephus and various rabbinic traditions show that in a court of law, a woman's testimony was often considered secondary to a man's, or in some cases, dismissed entirely.
Wow. So if you are fabricating a persuasive story to win over converts in that exact society, women are the absolute last demographic you would invent as your primary foundational witnesses.
Exactly. It is what historians call the principle of embarrassment.
The principle of embarrassment.
Right. A historian looks at that specific detail and thinks they wouldn't have made this up because it actively hurts their PR campaign.
They wrote it down because, embarrassingly enough for them, given their culture, that is just who actually showed up to the tomb.
Yeah, that is a cornerstone of historical analysis. The text quotes Luke 24, which notes the women entering and not finding the body. Preserving that culturally awkward detail suggests an adherence to an actual event rather than a calculated manufactured lie.
That is wild.
It is. Even highly critical non-religious historians often treat the empty tomb as a factual historical datum, largely because of this specific detail.
But there's a massive geographical hurdle here, too, which we touched on at the very beginning of the deep dive, the Jerusalem factor.
Yes. The Catholic argument points out that Christianity exploded in the exact same city where the execution took place.
Right, and the local religious authorities and the Romans were highly motivated to crush this new movement before it caused an uprising.
Very motivated.
If the body was still in the tomb, all they had to do was take a short walk, roll the stone away, produce the corpse, parade it through the public square, and the entire religion would be dead in an afternoon.
Literally an afternoon.
You just cannot sell a bodily resurrection in the same zip code where the guy is still publicly buried.
No, you can't. The fact that Christianity survived its initial weeks in Jerusalem implies that the authorities could not produce a body to silence the apostles. The tomb was genuinely empty.
At the same time, though, an empty grave just means a body is missing. I mean, grave robbery was an actual, well-documented problem in antiquity.
Oh, absolutely.
A missing body does not automatically equal a resurrection. We have to look past the empty real estate and focus on the people making the claims.
Right. And the apologetic argument moves next to the eyewitnesses. And again, the early texts are not claiming some sort of mystical internal feeling or a vision during a dream.
They are concrete claims.
Very concrete physical encounters. Peter, the 12, James, and Paul. But the most substantial claim brings us back to that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15.
Which states what?
It states, Jesus was seen by more than 500 brothers at once.
500 people in one mass event. I mean, that is a staggeringly huge claim to make in a written document.
It really is. And Paul adds a crucial caveat to that claim. He writes, many of whom remain even to the present time.
Wow. It is the ancient equivalent of putting references available upon request on your resume. You are actively inviting a fact check.
He is effectively daring his readers to go find these living eyewitnesses and interrogate them.
Ugh.
The source argues that if this were a complete fabrication, offering up hundreds of living witnesses who could easily contradict your story is a spectacular way to ruin your own movement.
Okay, let me play skeptic here, though, because I see a massive logistical loophole in that argument.
Lay it on me.
Paul is writing this letter to a church in Corinth. Corinth is in Greece. It is hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem.
Sure.
In the ancient world, writing "Go ask the 500" is a pretty safe bluff if you know absolutely none of your readers have the time, the money, or the resources to book a multi-month boat trip to fact-check you in Judea. Does the source address the reality of ancient travel?
That is a very sharp historical observation. But we have to remember how surprisingly connected the Roman Empire actually was during this period.
Was it really that connected?
Yeah. The Pax Romana, the vast network of Roman roads and the maritime trade routes, meant travel and communication were much more frequent than we often picture.
Okay, so it wasn't impossible.
Not at all. It was not just a matter of the Corinthians sailing to Jerusalem. People from Judea, including merchants, travelers, and early Christians, were constantly moving through major economic hubs like Corinth.
Ah, so word of mouth traveled efficiently along trade routes.
Exactly.
So Paul's bluff could still be called just maybe by the next trade caravan coming from Judea instead of a personal fact-finding mission by the Corinthians?
Precisely. If a massive claim like a 500-person appearance was a known joke or a debunked lie back in Jerusalem, that counter-narrative would have reached Corinth through those same communication networks.
That makes a lot of sense.
Making the claim publicly in a circulating letter means the text itself would eventually make its way back to communities closer to the source. It functions as public verification language, which is incredibly risky if the event never happened.
Okay, so we have public claims, but let's look closer at the psychology of the witnesses themselves. Up to this point, the people named Peter, the 12, the crowds were largely followers.
Right.
These were individuals who had abandoned their livelihoods to follow Jesus. They deeply loved him. After the horrific trauma of a brutal crucifixion, isn't it highly probable that grief played a massive role here?
That leads directly to the hallucination theory, which is actually one of the most widely held alternative explanations for the historical data.
So the idea is that driven by extreme grief, exhaustion, and a desperate longing to see their leader again, the disciples' minds essentially play tricks on them. Because bereavement hallucinations are a well-documented psychological phenomenon, people frequently report seeing or hearing a recently deceased loved one in the days and weeks following a death. It is the mind's way of coping with sudden loss.
It is very common, and the Catholic argument tackles this psychological model by introducing the concept of the hostile witness.
A hostile witness.
Right. A hallucination theory works reasonably well for a grieving mother or a devoted, heartbroken disciple. It completely falls apart when the person claiming the physical encounter actively hates the movement.
Which brings us to the Apostle Paul.
Exactly. Paul's psychological profile was the polar opposite of a grieving follower. He was not anticipating a resurrection.
He was a Pharisee.
Yes, actively and violently persecuting the early church. He viewed the Christian movement as a dangerous, blasphemous heresy that needed to be eradicated from Judaism.
He was essentially an inquisitor. He was hunting them down, throwing them in prison, and approving of their executions.
The book of Acts describes Paul traveling to Damascus specifically to arrest Christians. And suddenly, he experiences a blinding light from heaven, falls to the ground, and hears a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?"
And then what happens?
When he asks who is speaking, the voice says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting."
And his life completely pivots. I mean, the movement's greatest and most violent threat suddenly becomes its most prolific missionary. He goes on to write half the New Testament.
This is where the source points out the hallucination model's fatal flaw. Hallucinations are internal projections of what the mind deeply desires or expects to see. They are born of grief or anticipation.
And Paul had zero desire to see a risen Jesus.
And zero expectation of it. He was actively trying to destroy the very idea of it, yet something external transformed his entire worldview in an instant.
So let's synthesize the data points we've analyzed so far. We have an early creed that beats the standard timeline for legend formation.
Yeah.
We have an empty tomb anchored by culturally embarrassing female testimony. We have the geographical audacity of launching movement in Jerusalem. We have hundreds of living witnesses invoked for public verification, and we have a hostile enemy suddenly changing teams.
It is a dense sequence of historical
It
events.
really is. But talk is cheap. Beliefs only really carry historical weight when they are severely tested.
That shifts the analysis from what these individuals claimed to what those claims actually cost them. The argument leans heavily on the concept of martyrdom.
Because there is a profound psychological difference between dying for something you genuinely think is true and willingly dying for a hoax that you personally manufactured.
Oh, absolutely. People will die for a lie all the time if they have been tricked into believing it. Cults are a tragic example of this.
Right, but human beings do not willingly endure torture for a conspiracy they organize themselves.
The historical record points to the apostles enduring severe punishments. We are talking beatings, imprisonment, exile, and ultimately execution.
So if they had simply stolen a body in the middle of the night and hidden it in a cave, the moment the Roman authorities threatened them with crucifixion or beheading, the conspiracy would break.
Someone would confess the location of the body to save their own skin.
The body is buried outside Jericho, please don't kill me. I mean, it's just basic human self-preservation.
The fact that they maintained the claim to the bitter end, coupled with the sudden birth of Sunday worship and the rapid spread of the religion, is presented as evidence of their genuine, unwavering belief in what they physically saw. They did not die for a philosophy. They died for a claim of a physical event.
I imagine the Catholic Church does not treat this as just an inspiring spiritual metaphor or a nice story about hope. Does the Catechism actually draw a hard line in the sand about this being a literal historical event?
It is incredibly explicit about the historicity. Sincere Catholic cites the Catechism, specifically referencing CCC 643.
What does that say?
The text argues that given all these testimonies, the resurrection cannot be interpreted as something outside the physical order. The exact phrasing is that it is impossible not to acknowledge it as an historical fact.
They are planting a massive flag in the dirt of the first century. They are arguing this happened in real time, in physical space, and leaves a historical footprint.
To illustrate how all these historical pieces fit together, the apologetic argument uses a courtroom analogy.
Oh, I love a good analogy. Let's hear it.
So if a prosecutor brings a single witness to the stand, a defense attorney can easily poke holes in their testimony.
Yeah.
Their eyesight was bad, the lighting was poor, they were confused, or they had a personal bias.
One witness can always be dismissed because human memory is famously unreliable, especially under stress.
Exactly. But this case is built on a cumulative convergence of evidence. You have the early creed. You have the embarrassment of the female witnesses. You have the geographical problem of preaching in the execution city. You have the sheer volume of the 500. You have the sudden conversion of a hostile, violent persecutor. And you have the ultimate sacrifice of the original claimants who refused to break under torture.
It is not one fragile strand of evidence. It is a reinforced cable.
The conclusion of the source is that legends simply do not behave this way. They do not begin immediately, they do not empty physical tombs, they do not convert sworn enemies on a dime, and they do not create willing martyrs in the very city where the execution just occurred.
We have covered a vast amount of historical territory today.
We really have.
We started with the skeptic's premise that the resurrection is a late developing myth. We then watch how the Catholic apologetic argument dismantles that timeline using the early creed in Corinthians. We explored how the empty tomb relies on the culturally unlikely testimony of women.
Right.
We examined the logistical challenge of Paul dropping 500 references to a distant audience in Greece. We analyzed how a hostile witness breaks the psychological hallucination theory. And finally, we looked at the psychology of martyrdom, the human refusal to die for a self-invented hoax.
It is a meticulously structured, overlapping argument designed to show that the legend theory lacks the historical explanatory power to account for all these disparate, chaotic facts.
So, turning to you, the listener, what stands out to you? When you look at this specific stack of historical claims, which piece of evidence makes you pause and reconsider the timeline?
Yeah, is it the linguistic dating of the creed? The psychological profile of Paul? Or maybe the audacity of launching the movement in Jerusalem?
It really forces a massive reevaluation of the raw data we possess from the first century.
It does.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Toward the end of the article, there is a brief mention of something called a sudden shift in messianic expectations. It is just dropped in as an aside, but I challenge you to ponder the sheer human psychology of that idea.
That is a massive anthropological puzzle in its own right.
It is. Think about how nearly impossible it is to change just one person's mind about their deeply held political or religious beliefs today. People dig your heels in.
Oh, big time.
Now imagine trying to completely rewrite an entire culture's deeply ingrained, centuries-old religious framework. To take a rigid belief system about what the Messiah was supposed to be, a conquering political king, and alter it to center around a crucified carpenter practically overnight.
It is a huge pivot.
If not a resurrection, what specific, tangible sequence of events could produce such a violent, sudden, and permanent pivot in human history? I will leave you to investigate that puzzle on your own time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.